Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Eintema, president of World Boston, and I am so pleased to welcome you all to Chat and Chowder. Yay! Yay! This is our first in-person chat since January 2020. We've all spent a lot of time together on Zoom, but this is our first in-person chat since that time, and many things have changed. It's also our very first hybrid event. So we are here tonight with each other, which is great, and then we're also joined by a large group online. So this portion of our evening is going to be on Zoom, and then after we finish the program, we'll go back to networking and mingling. So in any case, we're so happy to be with all of you virtually or in person. Right away, I want to thank our host, James DeBellis from Foley Lardner and other colleagues who are hosting us here in this beautiful location. Thank you very, very much. A few more announcements. I want to shout out Natalie Mace, who is our manager of operations and global engagement programs, making this event happen, along with other great World Boston colleagues here. Hello, great colleagues. Couple of little reminders. It feels like a benediction or something, but as you may know, our mission at World Boston is to foster engagement in international affairs and global cooperation. So whether they are virtual or back in person or hybrid, our programs will probably always change, but this mission persists. So thank you for being here and being part of this mission. Please learn more at worldboston.org, and if you can, please support us financially. Okay, so next, we invite you to upcoming events. On March 3rd, we will be co-hosting online a book talk with NEID featuring Fatima Sumar of the US Millennium Challenge Corporation, discussing her book, The Development Diplomat, Working Across Borders, Boardrooms, and Bureaucracies to End Poverty. Okay, a little bit on housekeeping. Of course, turn off your phones. And note that when we turn to audience Q&A, the guests in the room are going to walk up somewhere. Natalie and Josh will help you walk up to, oh yes, to these two mics. And yes, you have to speak into both of them. We will take several questions from Zoom. This is a little bit of a new manner for us, but we will do our best to take some questions from Zoom. So you put your questions into the Q&A, and magically, our colleagues are going to get hold of some of them. And now we are, in fact, joined by Dr. Fiona Hill, who will discuss, among many things, her book, There Is Nothing for You Here, which there is a lot for you in, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. It's an amazing book. For the sake of time, I'm going to abbreviate your bio.
Please do.
Okay, but you can read it in full on our website. Dr. Hill is a senior fellow at the Center in the Center on the US and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. She recently served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the National Security Council from 2017 to 2019. 2006 to 2009. Served as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. So originally, and I'm not certain on the pronunciation, from Bishop Auckland.
That's
okay.
right.
All right. In County Durham, in the northeast of England, Dr. Hill is also somewhat one of our own in this area, having earned her PhD at Harvard and worked there for several years. So welcome, Dr. Hill.
Thank you.
Let's jump right in. So this book has been referred to places as three books. There's so much to it, part memoir, part history, part policy prescription. It's also kind of a unified field theory of US or East-West relations since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I tonight can't help myself but offer that I found it very touching. I think we were studying Russian in Moscow in the same year.
Yep.
Probably with similar thoughts and concerns about the Cold War. So looking back on those days, I and my friends watching the wall come down in 1989, I think many of us thought, well, that's it. All the problems in the East were due to lack of free markets and democracy, and we thought those two things actually required and caused each other.
Yeah.
Kept looking for contrast between us and them, and to exaggerate a bit, I think many of us thought with our great markets and institutions, we could just fix things. Peace and prosperity would prevail. But your book really cracks that open. I found the following quote. Yes, I'm going to read your own words to you, and then I will shut up, but it is so striking, was really stopping in my tracks. The constraints on mobility in America today form the core of our country's ongoing crisis, as do a similar set of problems in the United Kingdom. They mirror challenges that have dogged our historic adversary, Russia, for decades. And unless we figure out a way to solve them, Russia's fate and its slide into authoritarianism since 2000 could well be our own. Wow. So it's surprising to characterize, to me, it's surprising to see the UK, the US, and Russia characterized as so similar. So what led you to this worldview?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here tonight. This is a great place to be, and I'm very thrilled that I'm basically the first speaker in the new hybrid age. We're in a new age of all kinds of things, I guess, at the moment. So thank you to James and to your other colleagues for hosting us. I'm really delighted to be here. And in part, part of the reason that I've come to these conclusions is about timing. I'm looking around here, and I see people from different ages and obviously different backgrounds. And I came to do my master's degree first of all in what was Soviet studies, just probably about the same time that you were finishing up your studies, because if you were in Moscow at the same time as I was, that was 1987, 1988, to Boston, so in 1989. And the Boston that I found in 1989 was not the Boston that we're sitting in, right here. And so, those of you who have lived here, grown up here for multiple generations, you kind of cast your mind back to the period of the 1980s and the 1970s, Boston was struggling. And I just come from the Soviet Union, which was not at all what I expected it was going to be. So in 1987, when I went to study in Moscow, and you went there to study there too, Mary, I mean, the reason I chose to go to study Russian was against the backdrop of the war scare of the 1980s, the Euro missile crisis, which from the point of view of somebody living in Europe, and particularly in the United Kingdom, was much more consequential than the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, if the Cuban Missile Crisis for anyone then who was younger and around in the 1960s, that was just off certainly the shores of the southern parts of the United States for sure. But the Euro Missile Crisis involved the stationing. There were already nuclear missiles, nuclear capable missiles in all the way across Western Europe and Eastern Europe, but this was a new category of weapons, the SS-20 and the Pershing Missile Crisis. Of course, the Pershing missiles, when I was a kid, I had no idea what they looked like, and actually, even today, I'm not even sure what a Pershing missile or an SS-20 looks like. But anyway, here we were all being told that there was a whole new category of missiles that were more deadly than before, that actually the SS-20s might even give the Soviet Union an edge, and mutually assured destruction was sort of teetering around on the abyss, and it was highly probable that there could be an outbreak of war. And in November of 1983, we're in a moment like we are right now. Here we are just on the verge of what I would suspect in the next 24 hours could be a massive move of Russian forces into Ukraine, for like the third time that Russia's gone into Ukraine. I'm sure we're going to talk about all of that. And also the threat, potentially the use of nuclear missiles, because the Russians have been exercising with nuclear capable missiles and are talking about moving Iskander missiles into Belarus, right next door to Ukraine, getting closer to Poland's borders. And there already are Iskander missiles, just for those of you who haven't really thought about that, in Kaliningrad, the exclave of Russian territory between Poland and Lithuania and Belarus. And when I was in my previous position at the National Security Council, one of the last things I heard Vladimir Putin tell President Trump was, well, Donald, do you remember the Euro missile crisis? Because your European counterparts certainly do. And I remembered it too, because that was why I decided to go and study Russian. And so, getting back to where I just left us before I went on this digression into nuclear missiles, SS-20s and Pershing missiles, was that I decided to study Russian against the backdrop of the war scare, mostly because I was actually terrified about the prospect of nuclear war. And, for those of you who are my age and older, you might remember the popular culture of the 1980s was absolutely filled with it. There was the Sting song, the Russians love their children too, kind of hoping that the cooler heads would prevail and, we weren't going to blow each other up, 1985. There was Threads the day after, movies and documentaries and all kinds of dystopian novels. And, as a young, impressionable person, I thought, well, that's it, we're done. Who cares about climate change? We thought at the time there'll be nuclear winter, Armageddon, we'll be living through the darkest age possible. We won't be able to come out of whatever, bunker we're in for, for decades. And when we do, every, kind of end of Earth movie was, you probably remember it too. And so that was absolutely it. So I decided to try to do something practical, go study Russian and try to figure all this out, as I kind of recount in the book. And as I get to Moscow in the September of 1987, I'm just stunned. I've never lived in a big city before. I've only lived in my northeastern part of England, or St Andrews in Scotland. And the northeast of England is on terrible times. The northeast of England is the centre of all the heavy industry in the United Kingdom, nationalised after World War II. There's hardly any private sector, development. We've just gone through this awful wrenching period in the 6 or 7 years before I get to Moscow of massive deindustrialization and mass unemployment, the kind of same thing that hits Boston and other places in the United States at different points. Everybody I know is either unemployed or looking around for a job. My father's cycled through multiple jobs in coal mines, which were admittedly already unprofitable before mass privatization under Margaret Thatcher. But the steelworks in the town won over, closed down. Every single person lost their job in the town. The wagon works for the railways and et cetera, et cetera. And, my town's boarded up. There's nothing in the shops because nobody has any money. And I get to Moscow and, whoa, hang on a second. There's nothing in the shops. And it's not because nobody has any money, but the supply in the USSR has broken down because central planning has run out of steam. This is the northeast of England on steroids. It's all nationalised industry. It hadn't really, kind of fully penetrated my mind at this point, thinking this through, of course. I've been studying Russian, but when I got there and I saw it, I was like, oh my goodness, look at this. This is just like home. And this is the first big city I live in. And I'm shocked. This is the superpower. This is a country that was going to blow everybody up. And, yes, there are really impressive cultural attributes to Moscow, the opera, the Bolshoi, you name it. And somewhere out there must be those missiles, but there's nothing in the shops. And people are, not very happy. And you can see the whole thing is falling apart. And it's the same phenomenon of deindustrialization. And within a few years after that, after I started at Harvard and I start doing my studies towards my PhD, and I start working at the Kennedy School of Government with Professor Graham Allison, who some of you may know, who was doing a lot of technical assistance projects in Russia in the 1990s. Russia does its own version of mass privatization, shock therapy, and boy, is it a shock. But it doesn't go from overnight, as you were sort of suggesting, like you just hinted at, with the Communist Party gone and the central planning lifted. It doesn't break out to be a capitalist free market overnight. And in fact, there's a lot of pain and suffering. Hundreds of thousands and millions of people also put out a job or working for essentially no pay in enterprises that they've basically lost their markets. The whole Soviet Union has fallen apart. All the supply chains have disappeared and being disrupted. And it looks, again, like the north of England. And then, as I mentioned, I've come here in 1989 to the United States, to Boston, and yes, I'm studying at Harvard, and this is just an amazing opportunity, and Harvard has all of these resources, but all I do is I walk out into Somerville, or I walk to East Cambridge, and MIT, most of the buildings are not there. It's all the factories that have closed down, it's the auto plants, the meatpacking plants. I meet all these people in Somerville who are renting out to students like me, rooms because they have no other source of income because they've all lost their jobs out. This place turns itself around. My part of Britain has not turned itself around. And, in Russia, yes, there's been, quite a lot of success because of oil and gas and other kinds of investment, but lots of parts of the, former Soviet Union haven't turned themselves around either. And I start to see increasingly in the United States, as I, describe in the book, I go out to the old industrial heartland of the US and I see exactly the same phenomenon happening in Michigan, in Pennsylvania. And it's really, I think, because I was sensitized to it, from growing up. I'm a product of deindustrialization and seeing things from the bottom rather than the top. I started in some of the places I probably would never have seen it. And what I'm talking about in the book, the the quote that you read there is really what happened in Russia since, which we're living the consequences of right now. We're going to be living the consequences for quite some time. Is that the grievances, the sense of dislocation and loss in Russia led to Vladimir Putin coming in 1999. And the base of Vladimir Putin's support is the old industrial heartland, Rust Belt, the tank factories, the tractor factories, the old, basically state farms, the massive industrial complexes, smokestack industries. It's not Moscow and even St. Petersburg, its hometown. It's not the Boston financial district equivalent. It's kind of the old part of Russia. And in those kind of places, people lost their sense of identity and dignity. And in a way, Putin's ultimate expression of this is trying to not just make Russia great again, but put some of that back. And for whatever reason, and we can talk about Ukraine and getting back Ukraine and the Donbass, the old industrial heartland of the Soviet Union, the biggest mining region outside of the Kuzbass in Siberia, a place that actually has a special significance to me, as I describe in the book, because when I started to study Russian in 1984, it was against the backdrop of the miners' strike in the UK, and the miners of the Donbass and the Kuzbass and miners in Poland and other places collected money for miners in the UK, and I got some of that money to study Russian. So thank you, miners of the Donbass. And now the Donbass is the centre of struggle and strife, and one of the reasons that many people in Donbass were also somewhat supportive of the developments since 2014 when the rebel forces started off there, was because they had that sense of being lost and being dislocated and wanting to kind of go back to the Soviet period, which wasn't going to come back.
Thank you. So this book is, as I want everybody to understand and then read it and buy it, is really as much about the US and the UK as it is about Russia. So I'm wondering if we can stay with that for a minute. You talk about how populism takes hold when opportunity is scarce, and opportunity is important because it's not that everybody wants an equal share, but they want an equal shake.
Right.
So how have you seen that play out in these three very different countries? And then maybe as an add-on to that large question, can we actually call Putin a populist?
Well, I'm actually going to start with yes, we can call Putin a populist, just to be very clear, because, and there's several attributes of this, which is again the cautionary tale. Because I also just want to make it very clear, I'm not suggesting that we're necessarily on the path of Russia. I just want to put it out there as I call it in the book, the ghost of Christmas future. And for any of you who absolutely were forced to read Charles Dickens in school, I know we were in Britain. In fact, I think about the equivalent of 10th grade, I had to write an essay about the significance of the ghost of Christmas future. So I just wanted to use it in the book after all. I don't want to waste that early efforts of literary thinking. But it always struck with me as kind of, it's the apparition the spectre of something that wasn't fully formed, but you could see out there the risk. Anyway, I'm sure all of our 10th grade selves have had to write it at some point. Will that ever come in useful? But actually, sometimes it does. And this is the spectre that we face if we're not careful. I mean to say we'll go down exactly the same path. But the point about Putin and the populism is fairly significant here, and I think it's just going to resonate with everybody right away. I mean, Putin comes in 1999. He's been with us for 22 years now, and he gives a big address to the country on the eve of the millennium, and he goes through all of the things that have gone wrong. And what's actually interesting at that point is he didn't really blame anyone else, but he blames the Russians themselves. That we weren't, good enough. We weren't really kind of seeing all of the problems. We let the country slip away. And at this point, the country's bankrupt. When Boris Yeltsin chose Vladimir Putin as his successor, basically Yeltsin's ratings were in single digits, even if that. And the country was completely insolvent, the currency had collapsed. And Putin, the first couple of periods in which he is president, he basically stabilizes the economy with the help of a whole host of really good technocrats. Many been, basically studied across the river at MIT.
Right.
I mean, a bunch of them are actually, kind of at Harvard and MIT and the business school in that sense at the time as I was. They put the country back on its feet again, make it solvent. And, then we get a kind of a period, we're all looking back now to 2007, the famous Munich speech or infamous Munich speech everyone's been reflecting on over the last, where he now says that, Russian foreign policy is going to change as well. But the other elements of making Putin a populist beyond him talking about I'm going to make Russia great again, I'm going to put things back, I'm going to put the country back on its feet, is the nature of the Russian presidency. So Putin isn't rooted in any kind of political party. The Russian presidency is, or the role of the president is enshrined in the Russian constitution as pretty much the one and only major institution in Russia. The Russian Duma, the parliament, is at this point pretty much a rubber stamp parliament. If one looks back in history, the czars, and the first Dumas were created in the early 1900s, were constantly basically dissolving parliament. And Putin can do that, the president can do that. Boris Yeltsin made it an extraordinarily strong presidency because in October 1993, he got into a spat with parliament over the various checks and balances in the different drafts of the constitution, and he shelled his way, shelling the Russian parliamentary building, essentially into submission, into a very strong presidential constitution. So Putin is not just commander-in-chief and president, he's in many respects a constitutional monarch, an autocrat. That's the nature of the presidency. And the only source of his legitimacy beyond the constitution is the people, the Russian people, the narod. And Putin has to re-legitimate himself all the time, and that's really the essence of populism. It's me and the people. It's the basically the underpinning of a system by the appeal to the people. I mean, he wants to appeal to the largest possible group of people, and so Putin's really emphasized Russian orthodoxy, the majoritarian, ethnic Russian speakers, and again, this is sort of playing out today. But everything, about the way that he has governed the country has been rooted in his relationship with the Russian people and doing things for the acclaim of the Russian people. And so in a way, Putin epitomizes populism. And it's the same kind of thing that we've seen emerge in the UK and the United States when leaders come forward and try to basically define the people and pick up on the grievances of the people, get the support of the people, always looking at the polling and not looking at the intermediate representative entities or institutions.
Thank you. Wow, I have a million questions, but I see time is marching on, and so I'm going to skip forward into the present day, very, very present day. You've talked elsewhere about how the U.S. and Russia see each other, and almost how they're playing different tunes off different sheets of music, different goals. So what is Putin's end game in this situation? Do we know? And how possibly can we walk back this situation? And then we'll go to audience questions.
Well, the last bit of the question is probably the most difficult to address about how we walk it back. So we're going to have to see, what unfolds in the next few days. And I would just say buckle up, for the next 24, 48 hours as well. Because we've already seen Putin at least laying out the next phase. And part of the end game has already been put on the table in December 17th of last year. The Russian government put forward 2 documents with 3 major goals in there. So this is, kind of basically what Putin wants as his end game. One was, of course, that Ukraine should never be part of NATO and Georgia should not be in any other former Soviet republic. The other was that NATO should pull back to the kind of positions, and there's quite a lot of ambiguity in all of this deliberately so, but rolling back the men that have been deployed there, and the infrastructure, missiles, equipment, conventional forces and armaments, back to positions in Europe that they were before 1997. And 1997 is a significant date because this is the date that I'm sure many of you are all aware that Russia and NATO signed what was called the NATO-Russia Founding Act to create the NATO-Russia Council. And it's also before the first big expansions of NATO, which came, of course, in 1999 first with Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. And of course, before the Baltic states and others joined. And then the third part of these demands is the United States pull back from Europe. And I've written about that in some of the places that people might have seen. And it's really kind of making it very clear that what Putin would like to see is what happened to Russia in the 1990s, when from the reunification of Germany onwards, through 1994, Russia and what he believes is a very weakened Russia was forced to withdraw all of the remnants of Soviet forces from East Germany, from rest of Eastern Europe, and also stuff from the Baltic states. And would like to see the US move back again as well. And so those are really maximalist demands. And now the new demands, with the recognition of Luhansk and Donetsk and Donbass, are also very clear, because the rebel forces of Donetsk and Luhansk don't control the entire territory of those two administrative regions of Ukraine. So the next phase is clearly, he's already given the Ukrainians an ultimatum: pull out of your own territory, recognize Crimea as being part of Russia as well from the annexation from 2014, and recognize Luhansk and Donetsk as independent. And is now basically, this is why I'm saying buckle up for the next 24 to 48 hours, because it's threatening military action to liberate, basically the rest of these territories.
So as a populist, or just as Putin, does he actually need the support of the Russian people? Many analysts are saying that war would not be popular in Russia, or has he passed that point? He just doesn't need it.
I think he actually does need the support, and so we're going to have to see what happens. Again, and how this plays out. And so, it is going to be very vital about how we respond, because there's always a kind of a tug of war going on over these things. And Putin is testing. He's testing to see what our resolve is going to be. He's testing to see how the Ukrainians are going to react. And we can't be completely sure. And he'll find out how the Russian people react. Now, he does need the support, because in 2024, when he goes up for re-election, he needs to basically show to all the kind of people around him as well, including the hard men of the security service who are pushing this, that he still has this popular support. This is the populist underpinning. And after the annexation of Crimea, his ratings shot through the roof. They were more than 80%, 88, 90%. They've been dropping. Now, they're not in the kind of Yeltsin single digits. They're 40, 50%. But polling, as we've all learned, is not an exact science. People often answer polling because they actually want to troll the pollster. Sometimes they just have something else in mind. Sometimes they say what they think the pollster wants to hear. And often when people are asked in Russian polls about what do you think of Putin, it's like being asked about, well, what do you think of Russia? Because it's he's been there for so long that people are hesitant. Also, people don't want to be, what are they taking my name? Will be making notice that I've said something negative. So it's hard sometimes to gauge Putin's ratings. But if we look at the recent equivalent of midterms, the Russian parliamentary elections, there was a pretty apathetic turnout. And clearly, although Putin isn't part of this party, it's something of a kind of signifier. When people ask in polls about what they think of the performance of the Russian government, it's usually fairly dismal. And there's a lot of dissatisfaction being expressed, not about great power politics or Ukraine or anything like this, but about all the things we think of as bread and butter issues, showing that there's quite a bit of socioeconomic discontent. There's been a lot of protest. And Putin and the people around him are obviously concerned, because otherwise, why would you try to poison Alexei Navalny and then put him in a penal colony as far away from Moscow as you possibly can? Mm-hmm. So he does need this. Now, the question is, has he done enough to get rid of the opposition? With Navalny in jail, Navalny's movement basically unraveled, Memorial and other human rights groups, opposition newspapers. Has he suppressed enough of what could be, the pushback at home? And again, we'll have to see, because when Alexei Navalny was poisoned with a Novichok in his underpants, one of the kind of bizarre assassination attempts one that can think of, he was, I suppose we'd probably think of a few more actually, but anyway, they're usually in the annals of medieval history, and I can think of quite a few in Britain. Maybe I should have gone there actually. Game of Thrones movement.
Oh my God.
But anyway, I thought they don't do any of those. Yes, sorry. Yeah, the next book, yes, Horrible Ways to Die. Very horrible and creative. But basically, Navalny was mobilizing people in the Urals and Siberia, and there was a lot of protests going on. There was a protest in a major city of Khabarovsk out on the Chinese border in the Russian Far East, protests against, basically the Russian government trying to impose their own mayor on the people of Khabarovsk. There's been labor protests. We're worrying now in DC that the truckers from Ottawa are on the way there. Well, the Russians had a trucker protest as well. It's, we kind of hear that maybe the Russians were somehow, funding the Ottawa truckers. Well, yeah, probably to get truckers, to stay away from Russia, because they've had also truckers felt that they were also being exploited. There was a big company that was run by one of the friends of Putin. They were kind of raising the prices of freight haulage, making it very difficult for truckers to make a living, say don't mess with the trucker, basically. And Putin learned that the hard way too. So, he's definitely worried, and this matters. And, as we're all going to see, aren't we, as to whether he pulls this off.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to try this. So we do need people to ask questions at the microphone. So I'm going to ask Ed to come up, and then 2 more people. So you're going to have to come around to the mic. And what I suggest is that you line up in that direction. So anybody else have a hand? Okay, Jim, and if you can go ahead and so that we can get in a number of questions. Ed, go right ahead.
Dr. Thank you for speaking before.
So speaking to both mics.
So you're going to stand in the middle?
Yeah, in the middle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. What can we do to stop it? We're not going to send troops to Ukraine. That's nonsense. What can we really do to bring it home to him? Can we somehow drive the price of oil down? Sanctions will really work. He has a huge sack of money put aside, and oil is traded. You can't really boycott oil.
Okay.
You show up at the Rotterdam spot market, no one's going to ask any questions where that oil came from.
Okay.
Yeah,
What do we do?
Ed's spot on that. I mean, with the also the war chest, as you mentioned there, the stack of money. I mean, what Putin's tried to do since 2014, the last time that sanctions were imposed after the annexation of Crimea, is try to sanction-proof the economy. And we've seen a lot of things happen, as Ed's already suggesting there. Basically, making sure that Russia's not overexposed in debt markets, getting main Kremlin-linked oligarchs to bring their assets back home so that they're not exposed either to asset forfeiture. I said before, paid off an awful lot of the debts, import substitution, and basically building up a stack of reserves and gold and everything else. And we've seen him, basically prepare for just this kind of eventuality. And, as you're suggesting as well, as oil and gas prices will continue to rise at the back of the crisis, the revenues will go into the sort of the state coffer, and from there they can go into the military budget, exactly. So he can keep on going. However, I do think that some of the sanctions will hurt, particularly some of the personal sanctions, and they will get the attention of some of the people around him, not the hard guys who are making these decisions, but the people we saw on television during the National Security Council meetings, because they don't have assets overseas. They actually want to have Russia pulled back from this kind of exposure and interactions. They're kind of purists on the old sort of Soviet-style front, autarky they would like to have back again. This is a hardcore of a fairly small group of people, but they seem to be the people who've got his ear at the moment. But there are also kinds of other things that we can do. Obviously sanctions are going to have an effect on all of us, and they would only really make a difference if they were done in conjunction with European allies and other allies as well. Something that would also make a difference, and this is why the administration's been taking everything to the United Nations, is if there's pushback from others in the world community that are not the people that they would usually expect. If the Chinese actually said something to Putin directly about invading Ukraine, that would give him pause. And there were some hints that the Chinese are not too thrilled about this, despite the real game changer of this joint statement that they made on the margins of the Beijing Olympics. It's a little surprising. But the Chinese have also made statements about the importance of Ukraine's territorial integrity and independence, and they're actually the biggest investors in Ukraine. Bigger than Russia at this particular juncture. So if you've got kind of a universal pushback, you manage to target some of the key individuals with ties to the Kremlin that are not obviously the major guys, and it's a uniform and united front. I think this would make something of difference. The problem is, of course, you're suggesting it's going to be really hard. And we're going to have to also watch what other countries do. Now, the UK, for example, my old country, is pretty consequential in this. The UK over the last several years had a scheme which often many countries have, where if you invest £2 million in the British economy, you get a visa. So a lot of oligarchs and business people have now become citizens of or permanent residents in the United Kingdom, especially in London. And it's not just Russians; it's people from all over the world. But there's a lot of Russians, more than 1,000 or more. And what we've seen is them using the legal system in the United Kingdom to go after investigative journalists like Catherine Belton from the Financial Times, who wrote this massive book called Putin's People, documenting all the kinds of things that they've been up to in London and elsewhere. She interviewed a lot of the oligarchs who are kind of living in London and fallen out with Putin to do a lot of an expose on the way that the system works. And if the British government clamped down on some of this, that would really get an awful lot of attention, because London, like many other places, has become a kind of a playground. Londongrad or London Stan, places like that, exactly. So this actually would make a difference too. The British government said they're going to do something, but we'll have to see, and that would get their attention too.
Great, thank you. So we'll go to Jim, and then just looking at the clock, I will. Sarah, you have a couple of Zoom questions, so we'll take one or two Zoom questions, and then we'll get back to live questions. Jim, go right ahead, please.
Thanks, Mary. So, Dr. Hill, if you will permit me to pivot to a slightly different region. In the aftermath of the recent war between Armenia and Azerbaijan,
Yes.
Russia has played a role,
Absolutely.
maybe peacekeeping. I'm curious if you read this as just continued influence by Russia, an effort toward control, or possibly even extending to reincorporation.
Thanks very much, Jim. I'm really glad you raised this, because while we've all been fixated on Ukraine, there's been a lot going on, as you're suggesting, in the broader region. And Belarus has pretty much at this point disappeared as an independent sovereign country. We'll not see what happens even de jure, because Belarus, years ago signed a union treaty with Russia, which wasn't supposed to be entire incorporation, along the lines of things you're suggesting here, that potentially Armenia, but was certainly meant to bring Belarus and Russia much closer together. The union kind of treaty, very much the subordination of Belarus to Russia, and that's happening. But that's happening because Alexander Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus, messed up his own domestic politics, tried to stay in power even longer than Putin. He's been actually president there since 1994, so another sort of 5 or 6 years longer. And obviously Putin, after the very flawed election, saw it in his interest to top up Lukashenko, because if Lukashenko was toppled by a protest in the street, would look up for Putin, who says he'd like to be around until 2036, gets back to your point about legitimation and needing to have popular appeal. And Lukashenko is less of a populist as an autocrat, because he doesn't have any popular appeal at all. His ratings are terrible. But in Armenia, you also see something that I think is really in the realm of control. We've also seen in Kazakhstan the deployment of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO, to go in, in the middle of a, what's kind of a power struggle behind the scenes, but also in response to, various protests again, with Nazarbayev, the former president, handing over to President Tokayev, and Russia making it very clear that they're going to go in there and maybe help out in the power struggle, but in return, a further reorientation of Kazakhstan away from balancing off East and West and China and Russia back towards Russia. And that's what's happened in Armenia as well. So Prime Minister Pashinyan was not Russia's person. In fact, he rose to promises, I'm sure you're more than aware because you've been asking the question, as a result of protests, socioeconomic protests. And he wasn't from the networks of patronage or corruption or political ties that were linked into Moscow. He was, a completely different person from the grassroots activist. And the Russians have not been happy with him at all. In many of the old style, the Armenian leaders have been either tied to Moscow. And the Russians, I think, taught him a lesson in the summer of 2020 when they allowed Azerbaijan. I say allowed because although Azerbaijan's territory was being occupied by Armenia after the war over Nagorno-Karabakh, the territory outside of Karabakh itself, we've had almost 30 years in which there's been very little movement diplomatically. And 30 years of also telling the Azeris that there was no military solution. And then suddenly there was one. This is, kind of rather astounding when one thinks about the fact that there is a Russian base in Armenia. There are Russian border guards who guard all the borders with Armenia. And the Russians have been pushing to have a peacekeeping operation in Nagorno-Karabakh since the 1990s, and both Armenia and Azerbaijan wanted to keep that out. And then suddenly we have an outbreak of what looked like, again, another sort of skirmish and another kind of crisis, and it's a sort of an ongoing low-grade war, and it breaks out into full war, and Russia does very little. until Azerbaijan has retaken the territory, which suggests that there was some kind of deal making behind the scenes. And in normal circumstances, one would expect Pashinyan to be pushed out after this. But Pashinyan is still in place. And the person who makes the announcement that the CSTO is going to be deployed to Kazakhstan is none other than Nikol Pashinyan, because Armenia has been given the chair of the CSTO. And we'll have to see what happens with Armenia, Kazakhstan, and the other former Soviet republics, and what they might get pressured or not pressured to do when things move further into Ukraine, because Russia wants to pressure them as well to recognize Crimea. Anyway, it's a very tricky situation, because I worry now that the rest of the region is going to now get pressured and feel very much under pressure to basically also recognize the dismemberment of Ukraine.
Okay, thank you very much. So moving from Armenia, I think Sarah, maybe if you have like 2 questions, we can link them up, and we'll see how we'll do with more questions after that.
Okay, great. So I come with questions from our friends on Zoom. We have one question from Eileen Babbitt. Do you think the U.S. could have prevented the escalation that created this current Ukraine crisis by responding more reassuringly to Russian fears?
I don't honestly know how we could have responded more reassuringly, because a lot of the fears, let me just sort of find the right way to because it's an interesting way that Eileen has phrased this question, actually. I don't like the formulation of it from the start, actually. Okay, so let me start with the word fear or security. The Russian word for security is bezopasnost, which is without danger. We never have a world without danger. We never have a world without fear. Everyone has risk. And just recently, what I'm not quite sure where Eileen was pushing this question. I know Eileen, so it's kind of interesting, so where she's pushing the question here. The foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, suggested that all of the members of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, so all the European countries, Central Asia and the Caucasus, should write in, I guess, to them, as kind of answers on a postcard, please, for your exam question, about how do you see the indivisibility of security? Because the Helsinki Final Act that helped in the 1970s, that set up the idea of the security arrangements in Europe, was supposed to have the indivisibility of security, that your fears and your sense of security shouldn't impinge on someone else's. Russia seems to be incredibly fearful of Ukraine, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Moldova, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, pretty much everybody else having some kind of independent position and some kind of policy that's in opposition or contrary to what Moscow's can be. And so if we look at the totality, the sum of all of the fears here, Russia is fearful about the United States getting capability. It doesn't have nuclear weapons. Actually, the Russians have capabilities that we don't have in nuclear weapons right now in terms of hypersonic missiles. Goes back to the Cold War. We can resolve those by basically having a series of arms control negotiations, strategic stability talks that we were getting involved in. Russia has a considerable amount of fears about the preponderance of NATO's conventional military power. We have let slide the conventional forces in Europe treaties that we built up in the 1990s. They've been in abeyance since 2007, and the Russians threw them out in 2015 because they didn't want to withdraw troops from Belarus and Moldova, for example. We could go back and renegotiate and start to talk about these. The administration has put these on the table many times. But what Russia fears most of all is not having a buffer. And it fears other countries having capabilities and offensive, defensive capability. It fears many of the things that the other countries fear from Russia. And so we get into, the kind of a problem, and this gets back to the origins expansion of NATO. I will just say quite openly, I thought expanding NATO was a very bad idea in the 1990s from the perspective of what the kind of relationship it would lead to with Russia. But then I wasn't Polish, Czech, Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian, Armenian, or any other country on the border of Russia that's had very different historical experiences. There's a lot of push from those countries to join because of their own fears, which got assuaged by expanding NATO. And we tried, perhaps not the best way, to create with the NATO-Russia Founding Act and the NATO-Russia Council a way of dealing with Russia. We've made lots of mistakes, and I think there's been lots of miscommunication. But given the Russian mindset about security and having a world in which they would frankly like to have others fear them, but them not feeling the same degree of fear, the answer to that question is no, we couldn't possibly have done.
Thank
Great.
you.
And then you've got another one from
Yes.
Zoom. Yep.
One more from Zoom. This is from Mark Schneider. Is it inevitable that the Baltics are the next targets? What should the West do differently than we did for the Ukraine?
I don't think it's inevitable that the Baltics are the next targets, just to be clear. Although I think that there's an awful lot of concern about pressure. We've been worried about tanks going into the Baltics and aircraft. There's been all kinds of already provocations in the Baltics. We have seen the exfiltration at times of Baltic intelligence people across the Russian border, for example, and law enforcement, and efforts to stir up trouble among the Russian-speaking population over different periods of time. It's one of the reasons why the United States has forward deployed forces to the Baltic states, and other European countries have NATO members as well, and to Poland for the same kinds of reasons, to try to assuage that sense of fear that is there in the Baltic states as well. Belarus has already been the target, and in fact we've just missed that. And I'll just sort of tell you that when I was at the National Security Council, and also when I was at the National Intelligence Council, the place we were most worried about beyond the Baltics was Belarus. It's already happened and we haven't even paid any attention to it. Belarus has been completely and utterly taken over by the Russians. I was already predicting that they would say they were not going to remove the troops from Belarus after these exercises. They announced that, pretty much even before I had a chance to say it. The talk about the Belarusians changing their constitution to allow the stationing of nuclear missiles in their territory. Belarus is pretty much gone. So that's already been, the target. Now we can, argue that maybe things might change, but it's not looking particularly good. And, we talked about Armenia and what's, happened there in terms of control Kazakhstan, for example. And, I talked today to a senior Georgian official who's just said they're absolutely terrified in Georgia right now, because they knew right away that Russia would recognize Lugansk and Donetsk. That's what happened with South Ossetia and Abkhazia. When people said it wouldn't, it actually happened. And they would say, well, they're all next in line as well, because they don't have the membership in NATO. They are feeling extraordinarily vulnerable, and they do worry, getting to Eileen Babbitt's question, that people will be very concerned about assuaging the fears of Russia and addressing Russia's fears at all of their expense, not just at the expense of Ukraine. So that this is, they've got a whole region now very much on edge.
Thank you. Okay, so let's see if we can get Mary's question in.
Sure.
Oh, those are a bit tall for you, Mary.
I know. All right. I was listening to NPR. They mentioned a gentleman named Samuel Sheriff.
Yeah.
Right. He's saying basically that he would create, they came up with a new agreement that would create a new consultative body for major power engagement on regional security, new norms for the behavior of NATO, and the Russia-led collective security treaty organization towards non-members. First off, have you had a chance to read the interview and the document they put together? And if so, what do you think about it? A fool's errand, or a good idea, or someplace in between?
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I have not managed to read it yet. I've been on the road and unfortunately been kind of preoccupied with all kinds of things that are going on. I know Sam very well, and some of the other colleagues, and I had a little bit, I think, of an idea of what they'd put forward. And there are some dangers inherent in, just even the way that you formulated the kind of the great powers of Europe, because what the Russians have been asking for, going back quite some time, and it's in fact what they thought that they were getting with the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997, was basically a rerun of the periods at different points in Russian history where the great powers sat down, the Concert of Europe, and basically decided European security over the heads of lesser powers. And the concept of Europe, back in the day would be the, Austro-Hungarians and, the French, and, you kind of pick your big empire. And it would be a handful making a decision for a small number. There's an alternate idea that's been put out there, but maybe it's just a variation by former US Ambassador to Moscow, Michael McFaul, Stanford professor of Helsinki 2.0, which is, another variation on this of kind of, let's do what we did in the 1970s with the Soviet Union, bring everybody back to Helsinki, the poor Finns, hosting us all yet again, and, trying to sort of thrash out how do we revitalize the Helsinki Final Act, and all of the security arrangements that we have now goes back to what I was mentioning before about arms control and conventional forces, and and it's the indivisibility of everybody else's security. So the security of Armenia, the security of Ukraine, the security of Moldova, the security of Portugal, and kind of all in Ireland and all these other countries that are not being consulted. And I just want to actually mention Ireland for a moment here, because what the Russians are saying that they want is for Ukraine, the countries on their border, to be completely neutralized. So not to be in any particular arrangement. They're saying the EU is maybe okay now, which is not what they said in 2014, just to be clear. That's when they annexed Crimea, which was over a tussle about Ukraine having an association with European Union. Mm-hmm. But they want to see, countries essentially demilitarized and completely neutralized. Well, that's Ireland. Anybody think of the Irish, apart from, the obvious, and we're here in Boston, but, the Irish military, it's not exactly, Ireland is a major military power. And after Ireland got its independence from the United Kingdom, Ireland made a very conscious effort to not join NATO and not to be involved in any kind of military alliances. And yes, Ireland's a member of the EU. What did the Russians just do recently? The fishermen of Ireland, exactly. The Russians decide to have war games, military exercises in Ireland's territory, and they also buzzed Ireland with military aircraft. So much for neutrality. So if you're trying to show the world that you actually want to have and you would respect neutrality, what the hell are you doing with the Irish? And I talked to the Irish ambassador, and they said that they'd written, a note to the Russian government saying, "Excuse me, hello, we're here. What was all this about?" And they got a really rude note back from the Russian foreign minister accusing them of aggression. And so, you can see where I'm going with this. So they're making and if the Russians were serious, they would never have even contemplated doing this, because it just kind of shows that, what they are really wanting to do, and this is why there's some danger in saying let's have all the big boys at the table, is push the little guys around as well. And I mean, what beef has Russia got with Ireland? And I mean, this is the kind of the point that I'm making is here. It is essential for us to think about diplomacy and negotiation. It's really important for us to put all of these ideas on the table and to think about them. We need to decide what we want, and we have to be open to negotiating. But it's extraordinarily hard to be negotiating when basically one side at this particular juncture wants to push things as far and as hard as possible to see what they can get before they then decide to go to the negotiating table. And if they're basically strong-arming and pushing around, countries like Ireland that have actually got absolutely nothing. There is nowhere in any universe that you can say that Ireland's got anything to do with Kiev, unless they've got an offence, or they take offence at Guinness being sold in the Irish pub on the main street in Kiev.
Okay, so we are really running out of time. There's two questions there. Barkev, you just came up. Please both ask your questions one after the other without sitting down. Yes, go ahead, you, and then Barkev, and we'll do just a lightning round. So quick questions, and then our window unfortunately closes.
Do you think that the solidarity that NATO has displayed over the last few weeks has taken Putin by surprise? And right. if it has, is there sort of a soft landing for him, where maybe he's starting to realize that he got in a bit over his head?
Okay.
And is there something he can do to backpedal where everyone is both equally happy and equally unhappy?
Great, thank you. And then we're going to go right to Barkev's question. So Barkev, come ahead and ask your question, and we'll try and fit in as much as we can.
Pretty quick, but the point is that I've been very sympathetic to the Serbs, especially. The way they were treated with Kosovo was taken away from them. The cradle of their civilization was Kosovo, Yet NATO got involved. What business did NATO have? Kosovo, Serbia was not asking for help. What business does NATO have to get involved? In that case, they got involved. It was the only reason they got involved. It was supposed to protect the Albanians, but they didn't do it because Clinton instead just bombed Belgrade, and that way Kosovo was emptied of Albanians. Then they let them back in. They took over the place.
So what role does NATO really have?
Another point too.
Okay.
Many years later, in the case of NATO allowing Turkey, one of its members, the Azeris could not do their own fighting. For over 30 years, the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh had kept that country and kept the Azeris out. Azeris 4 years ago tried to do it, they couldn't do it again. Turkey got involved. What business did NATO have to allow Turkey to do this?
Okay.
What's going on here? NATO is no good.
All right, so
That's
we've
all.
got, thank you.
Thank you.
So we've got two questions actually that sort of concern NATO.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, they tie together because, what Burkhardt said is, very much the view on the part of Russia and others about what NATO is. And it gets back to 1997. And this is why there will be no happy ending, no hard, soft landing, I'm afraid. Because, when the Russians signed the NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997, what they thought that they would get would be a veto over the decision-making of NATO. And I actually would commend to all of you a book by Mary Elise Sorotti from here.
Coming to speak here.
Yeah, so come and have come to that event. There's a shorter version of it in the November-December edition of Foreign Affairs about the whole, basically ruminations about NATO and NATO expansion, from the 1990s. And, as all of us are aware, that NATO was looking for a new mission for itself in this time frame. There was kind of a hope that, with NATO and Russian relationships and the Russian Founding Act, we'd put things on a different path. Russia was hoping that we'd have a veto over the further expansion of NATO. So I think this is 1997. In fact, what you're referring to happened in 1999 with the bombing of Belgrade. I was in St. Petersburg at that time at a conference with Russians, including many Russians who were very sympathetic towards the United States, and who at this point were looking at NATO, in a let's just say neutral way. We had set up in the 1990s something called a Partnership for Peace. I mean, a lot of the people around here, will remember that. Russia was part of this as well. We were doing, training operations with people. We had Russians and others at our war colleges, including in Garmisch-Partenkirchen in Germany. And we were looking at that as a kind of more of a glide path, a kind of a longer term arrangement that might, basically address some of these questions and the perceptions. And then we started to, as a result of pushes from countries who actually thought that NATO actually did matter for them, Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, and others later, to move away from Partnership with Peace to starting to thinking about countries joining NATO. But that comes in that period, and unfortunately, it comes at the period exactly when we have all of the wars in the former Yugoslavia. And when Russia sees that mission in Belgrade as being under the NATO auspices, the views of NATO change in a nanosecond. And what Burkhardt just said there is exactly what I heard from pretty much every single Russian, including those who had been pretty much neutral on NATO at the conference I was in St. Petersburg. People outraged on the streets saying, NATO is a military alliance. What has NATO got to do with this? You're telling us that NATO was, kind of basically changing, going in a different direction, a different mission, and then we see this.
Yep.
And then, what the Russians will now say is that not just was it in Belgrade, but then in Libya and in Syria and in Afghanistan and in Iraq, there becomes a kind of NATO missions. So NATO is a military alliance. Who is it directed against? And we've now got ourselves into that kind of problem where basically Putin has kind of said no more NATO. What's NATO got to do with anything? I do have to say on the Turkey point that Turkey plays a different kind of game with NATO as well. At times, this will be a really interesting test to see what Turkey feels about its NATO membership over what happens in Ukraine. Because Turkey has a very important relationship with Ukraine itself. Remember, Turkey used to also have sovereignty or suzerainty over Crimea prior to its annexation by Catherine the Great. The Crimean Tatars are actually Turks. And a lot of Crimean Tatars who fled Crimea live in Turkey itself. Turkey is a Black Sea power. Turkey hasn't actually liked NATO being in the Black Sea. You're right that Turkey did help Azerbaijan, but Russia gave the green light to Azerbaijan to move against Armenia in 2020 as well. And I think the Russians were a bit surprised when Turkey started to sell the Azeris drones. And also, one of the precipitating factors for conflict now is because Turkey sold Ukraine the same drones, and that they were used in a reconnaissance operation shot down in the Donbass. Turkey's got a very complicated relationship with NATO, and we're going to have to see really how it responds to this as well. But what's happening in Armenia right now is that Russia is actually stepping forward to be the broker of Armenia's future relationships with Turkey, talking about negotiating or renegotiating the protocols that were abandoned before, and also opening the border. And now we're seeing the old game among the Russian and Turkish political figures like the Russian and the Ottoman Empire when they parceled up the lands of the Caucasus and elsewhere, going on again. And with peacekeepers from Russia in Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia's own decision-making has been massively constrained. That's why I was mentioning, perhaps when I was turning away, that I'm pretty confident that Azerbaijan would not have moved against Armenia in the summer of 2020 had they not been given a green or a yellow light by Moscow. And Turkey was a bit of a surprise entrant. They came in harder than I think that the Russians expected. And now we've got the old play that we had in imperial times again.
Yeah, interesting. Wow. Unfortunately, our Zoom window is closing,
right.
but we are here. So first of all, we're going to remain in our seats until our speaker can get to the book table. Stay in our seats. And we are also going to thank Dr. Fiona Hill enormously for this very rich conversation.
I also would like to say thank you to everyone for such great questions. I mean, it's always very heartening to me as well to see how engaged everybody's in these issues. And we need all hands on deck at the moment with ideas and, thinking. So, if you've got ideas yourself to put on the table to everybody, I mean, please do. And I think, everyone is just trying to deal with, I wouldn't say that this is unexpected, unfortunately. It's got a long history to everything and there are so many complexities. But I think, we're going to need a lot of ideas about how we handle this. The world is just changing before our eyes.
Great.
So thank you.
Thank you.